My name is Monica Wilkinson Kelly. I'm the archivist at the Edith B. Ford Memorial Library in Oban, New York. This interview is being conducted as part of the Cayuga and Seneca Lakes Agriculture and Craft Beverage Memory Project. Today is December 16, 2021, and I am interviewing Eric Miller, winemaker and author. Good morning, Eric.
Good morning. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. You have such a long history, both you and your father. So can you tell me who you are and where you're currently located?
I'm Eric Miller. I don't use my middle name Bruce very often, so Eric Miller. I live and I'm currently in Westchester, Pennsylvania, which is southeastern Pennsylvania.
Okay, so a lot of the information I have for my interview came from your father, who was Mark Miller, and he was the founder of Ben Marl, and he wrote this terrific book in 1984, and I really enjoyed reading it. A lot of the focus was on your family. Now, your dad started out in Hollywood, is that correct? As a costume designer or something for 20th Century Fox.
My dad and mother were both, they didn't like to be being called Okies. Steinbeck made them uncomfortable with that term, but Dad was interested in art until his art teacher was tarred and feathered and run out on a rail. And so he didn't feel comfortable staying in Oklahoma.
Oh, no.
And like so many people from the Dust Bowl days, he blew west to California, where he studied art at Chenard's. And costume design is, I think, the first serious job he got with 20th Century Fox when he was out there.
Okay, and then he became an illustrator for a newspaper magazine and moved to New York City, correct?
Yes, magazine illustration was certainly, I think, a very attractive career thing for him, but he also did ads. He did the Pepsi Girl, I think she was called the Pepsi Girl, a beautiful long thing with cigarette holder, this tall, and drank Pepsi. So he did commercial art as well.
And okay, so then you were living in Hartsdale, New York, correct? Which is Westchester County, New York.
Yep.
And can you tell me about how the wine interest began?
That really is where it began. He commuted to the city. He was working for an art studio called Watts, W-A-T-T-S, and that was before he went independent. I think he just got interested in wine. He made a little home wine. In fact, up until about 10 years ago, I had a bottle of chickenpox wine. It was a wine that was made from California grapes that I was home from school with chickenpox and I stomped it for him.
Oh, gosh.
It was a golden and very thin rosé by the time that last bottle went. But anyway, he was really interested in it, and he had read Phil Wagner's book, and so he bought from Phil some, from Philip, some vines, and he planted them all around the edge of the property. It's a very small property in Hartsdale, and that began him growing grapes, and he was in the middle of being a home winemaker.
Okay, and I think I read in September 1957, correct me if I'm wrong, you and everyone your family purchased the property further up the Hudson. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah. Let's get this straight. My father bought that property. My brother and I didn't want to leave our friends and the block we lived on in Hartsdale. My mother did not want to do that. My father really wanted to do it. He wanted a weekend home. And so every weekend he would jam us into the big old Buick, and we would drive up the beautiful Palisades Parkway. That was one of my favorite parts of the trip. And then we had to work. And he bought an incredibly dramatic property from one of the many failing farmers in the Hudson Valley. He bought it from Wardell. I can't remember his first name, but it was part of a larger family property that he bought a portion of, that was partly on the Hudson River side of Route 9W, and probably a half a mile or so from the Hudson River, crossed the highway, and then rose several hundred feet to have an incredible view of the Hudson Valley below.
Right. Yeah, I think I wrote down my notes. William Wardell was a grandson of Mr. Cawood, who has a very significant history,
Yes.
Croton Point and up the Hudson. So experimented early on with hybrid grapes. So
Yes, on the property, there were some existing vineyards, and they were mostly Delaware, but also Duchess, which was a hybrid that Cawood created himself. It was a Chardonnay. I'm not sure what the other parents were in the cross, but so those two varieties were grown there, and they were being grown commercially in New York State. By the way, A.J. Cawood's granddaughter, Edith Meckes, was on an adjoining property, as was her sister. So we were right in the middle of that family, and they were a delightful family.
and I think Cawood was the oldest vineyard, one of the oldest, 1827 in Croton. He married into the family, Andrew, I understand.
Ah, okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but so then what happens? So you buy this property, or your dad does.
Yeah.
And then he decides to move to Burgundy. Is that correct?
Okay, well, here's a bit of non-wine history about the culture of our country. Dad was on his own by then. He had his own studio, or he was sharing a studio with Don Crowley, a brilliant illustrator. His interest in wine was growing at the same time that his career was threatened. Look magazine came out, and they were doing photography, and photography was taking the cover of magazines. Then Life followed shortly after that. And it really threatened his career, and he was just beginning to sell to Post, and I think he sold to Redbook. His pictures were used to illustrate stories. And he was in Europe. Illustration was still strong. Photography had not become as ubiquitous. And I guess they really hadn't figured out how to do everything in photography that the US was doing. I'm not really sure. So he went to Europe out of curiosity. One summer, he and my mother packed my brother and me off, and we went to Europe for a month and they dropped my brother and me off for at least 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks at a great place. And they traveled around wine country, driving everywhere, and he was totally smitten by it. I remember there was nothing that could make him happier than lunch of bread and cheese. Oh my God, it was a hot baguette, and he was so happy. And then when you were done, you'd open both doors to your car and you could pee on the roadside between them, and nobody could see you, and everybody did it. And we did too. So that really got him. And we returned, and he was gone. He was a goner. He just became a wine enthusiast. He became a wine romantic, which is not the same thing as a studied enthusiast. When you're a romantic, you just love it, love it. We had it for wine for dinner every night. My brother and I were oftentimes blindfolded, and a glass of wine was put in front of us, and we were told that if it was from Burgundy, it would be made from Pinot Noir and it would taste like this. And if it was from Bordeaux, it would be made from Cabernet and that family of grapes and taste like this. And we had to guess which it was. And we thought, all right, that's almost as good as milk. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think I read that in your, you also are an author, like your dad, The Vintner's Apprentice. So I think I read that story in your book as also. So
I get credit for that. My wife was the editor, and she took some very rambling writing and turned it into a reasonably good book.
okay, well, it is a great book. Both are. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So you learned about wine, or your dad learned about winemaking in Burgundy. He was inspired the Société. Can you talk about that? That inspiration came from?
As I said, my father was completely romanced by wine. And yes, he joined the Confrérie de Chevalier de Tasse de Vin, the Knights of the Vine from Burgundy, which was something that was created to promote Burgundy wines. And they cooked fabulous foods in fabulous places like the Clos Vougeot, and once a year would celebrate the harvest with 2 incredible dinners, like 10-course meals, maybe more. And one dinner, which was a church supper, and to me was the most exciting of all, because that's where you didn't have to be rich to come. That's where if you grew grapes and made wine, remember there wasn't such thing as a winemaker in France. They were called wine growers. It was inseparable that you grew and then fermented. Anyway.
And you returned, so you returned.
That was an incredible experience, but he was totally romanced. You said he learned to make wine. He didn't learn anything about making wine. He still thought you just threw the grapes in and everything that was supposed to happen did happen.
And you returned in 1967 to your estate in the Hudson River, correct? Hudson River Valley.
Yes. Well, we returned. Dad was commuting back and forth. He was absolutely dedicated. He tried to hire one of the members of the Latour family to come back and run his vineyard. And I think he got some tips from him on grape growing. He hired a Brit to come back and keep the vineyards up. The fellow destroyed the farm vehicles, and Dad was getting very frustrated. So finally, I think it was more like 65, we returned for a year, and then went back in 67, which was really, he was chasing his career and making the most of his painting at the time, because his plan was to retire from painting and become a full-time wine person. And so it wasn't 67 that we finally returned, and that was it.
Okay. And I forgot to ask, how many acres did you buy initially, or did your dad purchase Ben Marl? And
it was a 35-acre piece with a magnificent east-southeast exposure. From there, like I said, you could see the Hudson Valley, you could see the Berkshire Mountains, but even more impressive was in the winter when the leaves had fallen, you could see that any land, you could see all the way down to Newburgh, you could see an incredible distance. Any land that was within sight, there were terraces, vineyard terraces, that had, most of which had been abandoned. But you could still see the terraces where the horses had, pulled the plow and vines had been grown.
Oh, okay. It was challenging though, landscape, was it not? for the
Very
vineyard?
challenging. If we had stayed with horses, which in some ways we probably should have done, it wouldn't have been so challenging. But Dad wanted to be a current farmer. He bought a used tractor, and so the rows were way too narrow for a small Massey Ferguson tractor.
Do you
So
recall
they were
the,
dangerous.
right, I did read that. Do you recall the grapes that were planted initially? You helped do all of this as well. You were out there planting and.
That's right, because the American varieties came out, and it was all hybrids that went in. And it was Rava 262, I think, there was Seval, Blanc, Aurora. I could give you the numbers for those, but there were probably down at the house on the other side of the highway, there was probably 20 different varieties were planted, but larger quantities up in this ideal and very dangerous site. There was probably only about 5 varieties that were planted. There was no vinifera planted. Dad was exclusively interested in the hybrids. Excuse me, I have to cough.
Yes, and I also wanted to clarify a point. I think I misspoke. It was Underhill who was in Croton on Hudson or Croton Point. And
Yes.
Kaywood was related by marriage to Underhill and was the founder of the vineyard that became
Okay.
Balmoral.
Thank you. I thought maybe Kaywood had begun in Croton when you said that.
No, I'm sorry. It occurred to me it's Underhill.
Mhm.
And so in 1971, I believe on your dad's book, he applied for a commercial winery license. Is that correct?
Yeah, the process probably began in January of 71. By then, I had quit college. I was very undisciplined. I had no interest in formal education. I was far more interested in playing guitar. And I can say it now, smoking pot. But that didn't help my college career, but it was great for my singing career, and which did not make any money. And during the fall of 70, the vineyard got hit by 2 hurricanes. I was touring, and when I called home, he said the vineyards had fallen over and he needed to pick the grapes, and he couldn't find anybody to help him. And I thought, oh, this is an important break for me. I need to get away from what I'm doing. And so I came home and stayed home. That provided some consistent labor. And before then, I think Dad was, I guess he had read Phil Wagner's book, but he was not a studied viticulturalist, and he was not a studied winemaker. And
You had no background in agriculture, correct?
no, they had grown some
Other
cotton
than, your
in Oklahoma,
experiment in Hartsdale.
but quite a different thing. And I've found it to be very interesting. And so I bought the UC Davis Technology of Winemaking book, and in Cornell, there was great work, really dedicated people working on New York State viticulture and winemaking. And so there's some great resources there.
Right, there still is in Geneva. It's now
Yes.
called Cornell Agritech. I've changed the name, but but it was very expensive, over $1,600, I believe, to have a farm, or to have a winery, a commercial winery license. There was only one type of license you could get in New York State at that time. And grape growers were really struggling. They were dependent on the large wineries that did exist to buy the grapes. And your dad really changed the field completely and the wine industry in New York. Do you recall
Did.
that period? And
I think the amount for a license was either $1,100 or $1,700, which did seem like a huge amount of money. And I think the goal was for there not to be any more New York State wineries. I think the few that were there were very happy. And the whole three-tier system was being operated by a few bootleggers who had survived Prohibition and really had a stranglehold on how things were done in the way of wine and distilled spirits in the state. So there wasn't really a lot of conversation. Dad, on the other hand, this is the wonderful thing about not knowing, just bulldozed his way in and said, this isn't right. And he was joined by people who were very complimentary. I forget, I think it was Bob Woodward from somewhere in upstate New York. His brother Gary has a farm, had a farm at least, in Fredonia or Dunkirk, New York. And they began to work on writing a bill. And my father, who loved publicity, began talking about it, getting people to write about it. One of the things that you might know from having heard about him is my father had a golden voice, just a marvelous voice to listen to. He had the ability to tell a tale or a joke, whatever he was doing, although he was not a great jokester. Whenever his voice began to ring in the air, people stopped to listen. And he always told a good story. And he told a story of living in Europe and how beautiful New York State was and how wonderful it would be to have a wine industry. And people began to listen and write stories.
I think I read he went to Albany to try to get this bill going in New York State, in Albany, and it didn't work the first time, but he didn't give up. And then again, a bit later, he was involved in a task force was created to look at the potential of a bill to create such a farm winery.
Yes.
And he did testify, I believe, in New York City, according to his book, about that. And it did get some publicity in the New York Times. And then more and more interest became, because of his constant interest in trying to get this passed.
Yes. Yes. And that was probably a 2-year endeavor. It probably started in 70 when he was facing the possibility of getting a license. And then maybe it was 71. I know the farm winery bill, that wasn't in 71, was it? Wasn't it later?
No, it was actually, it finally did pass. Governor Carey signed it June 4th, 1976. But there were, I think, previous attempts, and there were various groups that didn't want this to happen. So the whole idea of the farm winery, I don't know, you probably know more about it than I. It was the idea of helping the farmers who were struggling and the grape growers at that time, and that they could sell their product directly to the consumer. So it eliminated the middleman,
Yes.
essentially, and they were allowed to open tasting rooms. I think it was initially when it was passed, they could produce no more than 50,000 gallons of wine, and it's been amended over the years and amended and amended. So without your dad, the idea of the tasting room, we take it for granted, that you go, say, to the Finger Lakes and to this area or anywhere, and you go to a winery and there's the tasting room. Well, that was really a direct sale method for the farmer to produce the wine.
And that was absolutely brilliant. I think one of the inspirations for all of that work that was done um, was being worked on in the state of Pennsylvania. And they actually passed it was not called it was a limited winery act. In Pennsylvania, it was very, very noticed that there were virtually no wineries, and maybe there were literally no wineries that used Pennsylvania grapes in Pennsylvania. The growers there had no outlet except to go either west to Myers was a big winery, or east to the Finger Lakes where there were some other wineries. So all the wineries were caught in that bind. When the Pennsylvania law was enacted, I don't think they were even considering being able to sell wine directly on the site. That really was a brilliant move by the authors of the Farm Winery Act in New York.
And you could also have, you could obviously have your tasting room. You could sell directly to a liquor store, your wine then, and also have satellite venues, tasting rooms and.
I don't think so. I don't think satellite venues were considered then. I think that came along later. But you could be right. We certainly didn't have one, and I didn't know of a single one.
Yeah, so he opens, I had a quote that was really great, that he was, after the farm winery passed, your dad said, he was worried that, no one would really be interested, that it wouldn't really take off. And then at the time of his book in 1984, he said, in less than 8 years, we now have almost 80 farm wineries. And today there are 391 farm wineries, and that doesn't include the wineries that have satellite offices and branches as well. And so that's certainly outnumbered the commercial wineries.
Well, a couple of things happened. One of the things that my father did, my father had a great imagination, very creative. He decided he would do his own version of the Commanderie de Bon Temps, which is the Bordeaux wine group, or the Chevet de Tastevin. He created a private club of people that he called the Société de Vignerons, the Society of Wine Growers. And people would pay an initiation fee, and then they would pay a fee to support a pair of grapevines over the course of a year. And then they could select a case of wine to be bottled under their own private label. And it became a really significant source of funding for us, but it also was a really great story. This was before Israel started selling trees in their deserts. It was a great idea. And at the same time, California, which had been producing a lot of wine throughout Prohibition, they continued to grow grapes, but then they could make wine, and they were part of this 3-tier system. But a few people like Robert Mondavi and some others started really homing in on making fine wine, really magnificent wines. And people not only had a story to write about this upstart Mark Miller in New York State, but they could write about those upstart Californians like Robert Mondavi, and they had a story. And Americans had a new hobby, which was wine drinking. There were great authors out there, some rather rudimentary books by people like Schoonmaker and Alexis Sacheen, which was not a rudimentary book. It was a great encyclopedia of wine. And so wine enthusiasts were being fed from a few different sources. And wine was becoming a hobby, popular.
Right, and so people felt that they would buy shares into your dad's, it was a form of promotion. They felt like they owned a piece of a vineyard and were now winemakers.
Very proprietarial. They would come up and they would tell me what to do.
Yeah, here's the quote your dad wrote on page 180. I was concerned that after all the stir to which I had contributed to create the opportunity for farmers to become winemakers, there might be, after all, no one interested. So I decided to apply for a farm winery license himself. So, but in the end, other people had already applied, I think 3 others before him. But your dad was given farm winery license number 1, from what I understand, because of his work and labor and getting this built.
He was there at the time. And, you know, we haven't even talked about Constantine Frank and all that he did and his extremely powerful influence in the Finger Lakes and the Lake Erie region, where people from Ohio began to follow in his footsteps. So there were some good stories up there.
Right, and your own experience. I just had some quotes today. In category 302, which is a New York State farm winery, there are 391. There were about 80, according to your dad in his book, in 1984. And then there are 97 FB, code 611 farm winery branches. So wineries would have a store, say in New York City from the Finger Lakes, and 110 wineries. So that would be commercial wineries. And so what was the difference between, do you want to talk a little? I know that initially it was 1,600 at that time in the 70s for a commercial winery. And the significant thing that your dad also brought about, it reduced the licensing fee to $125 when the bill was finally passed in 1976.
Yeah, and that was all such forward thinking. And while we're giving credit to forward thinkers, I think credit should be given to John Dyson. I'm not sure what he did, but was he Secretary of Agriculture for a while?
He may have been, I think, Commissioner of New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets.
I think you're right. But
yes.
He lived right across the river from us, from a very wealthy family. So he didn't have anything inhibiting his time. In fact, he started his own vineyard and winery, but he really supported this concept. And it took key people like him in the administration to make this seem like it was a reality, that it was something that really could be done and turned to the benefit of New York State. It took a few more years for New York State to have the really responsible and supportive stance that it has now, but it was starting then.
Yeah, I know, don't quote me about Dyson. I believe I have a photo here that was recently donated of your dad and J. Roger Barber, who was commissioner of New York State Department of Ag and Markets, and James Doolittle, who worked at Ag and Markets, and James and Carol Doolittle went on to create Frontenac vineyard here in the Finger Lakes, Antigua Lake. So,
and their energy really made the difference. It's individuals who are willing to spend their energy on something that hasn't been done yet that really get the credit.
Yeah, well, then you went on to, I have your book as well. You were at Benmar for a while, and then
10 years.
10 years, and then moved on and created your own vineyard in Pennsylvania. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I worked with Dad for 10 years. He was very much the artist who had a vision, and it was the only vision. By the way, these are two of my dad's paintings that are behind me.
Yeah,
This is the right one. The red one is a painting of a cafe up on Sacré-Cœur. We lived just outside of Paris for a while. And this one over here is a house that we lived in outside of London in Weybridge that he used for his romantic illustration.
I know in his book, it's beautifully illustrated with all of his pen and ink drawings as well.
I love those sketches. Those are so great. I have them all.
And this one too, I don't know, it looks like I'm not sure, a painting, a linoleum block. I'm not quite sure, but it's
It's
beautiful.
also a pen and ink. In fact, I was thinking of giving that original to the current owners of Ben Marl. I need to give them a call and find out if they would like to have it. It would be more appropriate there than for me to have it.
Oh, well, every illustration that he did is certainly remarkable. So
He had a great hand. Anyway, so I worked with him for 10 years and eventually it drove me crazy. He had an image and it was not my image. I wanted to plant vinifera. I wanted Chardonnay and Cabernet and Pinot Noir and some of the varieties that I was then drinking and identified with from France. And he was very much sold on these interspecific varieties that had been created 50 or 75 years before. And he had his own way of operating things is all I can say. And it was not my way.
well,
So-
father's son, you know.
So in fact, to my benefit, I had met my wife, Lee, and she in fact was doing an article on my dad and I guess the whole family for her little grape newsletter from Pennsylvania. She looked at my dad as a model, and he definitely was a model for how you get things done, how you get attention, how you get somebody to come to your front door to buy wine. And so when they came up for the interview, I met her, and then in a matter of time, I met her again, and that was it. I was done. And she didn't try to stop me from, so we married and she moved to Ben Marl. My father offered her a position as a secretary, and she said, "I'm not a secretary. I have 2 degrees."
A journalist, I think I read.
And she had a little PR company in Lancaster, and she was busy writing some books. Some of them were on wine. And and I obviously was not content. So I applied for a job and ended up leaving Ben Marl to move to Fredonia, New York, where I met the Woodburys, and where there was a lot of grapes being grown. And I got a job at Chadwick Bay Winery, very far north. I had never been harvesting grapes on the processing deck when it snowed before. That was a unique experience, and I had to leave. And I decided what I would do is go somewhere warmer where I could grow more tender varieties like vinifera varieties. So I began to look south. I looked to Maryland, Southeast Pennsylvania. Let me see. I went out to Long Island. I missed the vision for what more insightful people saw out there, and ended up finding a place in Southeast Pennsylvania, Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, and started a small winery there. We began as the smallest winery in the state. But with our background, that changed, and we got a little bit bigger. By California standards, really, really small. But by Pennsylvania standards, we were the biggest.
Oh, okay.
And for 30 years, we were very busy raising a family of 4 boys and establishing our winery. And by the way, we had a partner in our winery who was from New York State, from the Hudson Valley, who I contacted because I heard he was interested in the wine business, and he really was key to financing our venture in the early days.
Oh, okay. So,
So
but
I have a long New York State, deep New York State tie.
yeah, well, this all really started, I forgot to also mention that Marianne Krupczak was essential in getting this passed, former Lieutenant Governor of New York State, and then traveled around New York State to promote the industry and really listen to the grape growers and listen to their problems and figure out what can be done to help them, and not only to create pass the farm winery bill, but to promote the industry once it started. Promotion was really essential. I know your dad was a promoter. He was in advertising, so he was certainly, you know, skilled at that and understood that. And you mentioned California. There's a campaign that started soon after the Farm Winery Act was passed, where I think Governor Carey said, "Look out, California," you know. So because the wine industry is going to be growing in New York, which it did.
Yeah, and people like Frank Pryl, who was the wine writer for New York Times, although he was not willing to give anybody credit for making fabulous wines, he was willing to say, you better watch out because something is going on.
Right. I think your father mentioned in his book that he had invited him to go to the hearing in New York City at that time, and 76 or before, and he couldn't attend the hearing in New York City where your dad spoke at the task force, but did have an article and, you know, mention what was happening. So certainly all these factors, but, you know, your dad really was central to this. So we really, it's now a multi-billion-dollar industry in New York State, affecting tourism, agriculture, so many facets of the New York State economy. So we have a great amount of gratitude to give to Mark Miller and you for working so hard at Benmorrow. Is
Oh
there anything
God, I
else?
remember the tears. My dad was a great promoter, but he wouldn't do sales. And the thing about sales is they give you money. And the thing that we needed the most as a result of planting grapes and buying tanks and barrels was money. So I had to go out there and cold call people. And I remember stopping in the village at a great little wine shop. It had all the towns in Burgundy that I knew so well from living there. And I went in and was chatting with them, and wines were not expensive in those days. And I finally remembered, oh, well, the reason I came in here was I wanted to introduce you to our own New York State wine. And he laughed at me and he said, do you have a license for this? I said, yeah, we do. We're doing this legally. And he wouldn't even taste it. He just thought it was such a joke.
Wow. Yeah, I was searching for my quote in your father's book. He mentions you when he was thinking of getting the farm winery license. He said, and Eric has the personality and, you know, the vision or something to take on the job. So he certainly thought you were very capable of promoting Benmorrow. And what does Benmorrow mean, by the way? I forgot to ask you that question.
Oh, yeah. By the way, I think my dad gave me credit where it wasn't due in that. But Ben Marl was a discovery that he and a Scottish friend found at the bottom of a bottle, he says. Ben is Gaelic for hill, and the soils are very marlaceous, rather clayey soils that wouldn't have been so good if they hadn't been sitting on some upright shale banks so the water would drain out. So it really means hill of shale. And it had a nice sound to it. I think he did a great job of picking that. I'm so happy that the new owners of it decided to not change the name.
Okay. Well, I know you have, you mentioned you have the original copy of the Farm Winery bill that was signed, but.
I do. And now I have your address and I will send it to you. I'll wrap it carefully. It's got a pen in there and it's very official looking.
Wow. Or a digital copy would be great too. I'd really appreciate that. It's so hard to find the actual bill. And of
There
course,
were several of them that were made at the time that were signed. I think I gave one, I think I had two, and I think I gave one to Vic, the current owner of Ben Marl. And I don't know what happened to the others.
well, it's been amended over the years. I think now from 50,000 gallons initially, I think it's now something like 250,000 in New York State that are farm winery of finished wine. So, but
Yeah, if you look at the complexion of the wine business in New York State, it's all changed. Now you have lots of small specialty wholesalers who are doing great work. New York State is just promoting people doing business, at least in the agricultural sector. Very wise people running the show.
well, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else you'd like to add? I know it probably, you know, it may have happened a bit later, but without your dad's relentless trying to get this moving and trying to create the farm winery bill, it really changed the industry. So we owe your family a great deal of gratitude for that.
Well, of course, I guess the one that we haven't mentioned is my mother.
Oh,
Who was
right.
a practical one, who did the books, made the calls to collect the dues for the members of the Societe, was such a lovely woman, greeted every member personally and made them feel at home and supported us in our days when we so desperately needed money. So for whatever I can speak on behalf of my dad and mother, you're certainly welcome. It's all about how energetic and dedicated and how willing to play the fool you are to pursue an exciting idea to the end, because in the end, not everything is foolish.
No, absolutely not. Not in your dad's case. And I thank you. I thank you for your time. Again, this is Eric Miller, his dad, Mark Miller, a former owner of Ben Marl. And I thank you so much for your time and effort and energy and contribution to the industry, and certainly New York State. Thanks you. So.
And thank you for recording this all for posterity.
Okay.
I look forward to seeing you again.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.